Greetings, brave warriors and shield maidens. If you seek the strength and wisdom of the ancient Vikings, you've come to the right place. Don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel now and join our horde to strengthen this community of true Vikings. As you can see, our channel is new, so your subscription is crucial to our growth. If you're a true fan of the Vikings, show your support. Let the power of the Viking axe guide your hand to click the like button, and in the comments, tell us which city you're watching from so we know where in the world our stories are reaching, all because the wind howled through the fjord as the night crept over Skalvik, the small Viking village nestled in the harsh, rocky coast of Iceland. The waves crashed angrily against the shore, a warning, perhaps, from the gods. But Harold Ironhand, a warrior who had seen his fair share of battles, was not one to heed the winds. His broad shoulders, still clad in his chainmail from the day's training, were stiff, his breath coming in low, measured exhales as he surveyed the village below from the high cliffs. Something was wrong. "Jarl Harold!" A shout came from behind. One of the younger warriors, Eirik, scrambled up the path, his face pale and sweat-soaked despite the cold night air. "It's happening again. The Jotnar, they've been sighted near the woods." Harold's grip tightened on the hilt of his sword. He had heard the tales, rumors that had spread through the village like wildfire after the first attack a fortnight ago. Monstrous figures shadowed by the mist striking from the dark and disappearing before the dawn. Men whispered of giants, but Harold had refused to believe it. Until now. "Get the others," Harold said, his voice gruff, commanding. "We defend the village, as we always have." Eirik nodded and sprinted back down the path, disappearing into the gathering gloom. Harold watched him go, his mind racing. If the Jotnar truly were giants, beings from the ancient sagas, then they were dealing with something far beyond mere raiders. The very thought of it sent a shiver down his spine, but he pushed it aside. His people needed him. By the time he made it to the village center, a small group of warriors had already gathered, their faces set with grim determination. Among them was Bjorn, his closest friend and second in command, a hulking figure with a braided beard and a permanent scowl. Freydis, the shield maiden, stood by his side, her axe glinting in the firelight. "We saw them in the trees," Bjorn said, not bothering with formalities. "Moving like shadows. They're faster than anything I've seen, Harold." Harold nodded, gripping his sword tighter. "We'll face them head on. No running, no fear. They want to frighten us, break us, but we're Vikings. We'll give them a fight they'll not forget." Freydis smirked, her fingers tracing the edge of her axe. "If it's giants they want, we'll cut them down to size." The village elder, Håkon, hobbled over to them, his old eyes wide with fear. "Harold," he rasped, "these creatures, they're not of this world. You mustn't face them as you would any other enemy. You'll doom us all." "We'll see about that," Harold replied, though Håkon's words dug deep. He couldn't afford to show doubt now, not when his people were watching. The night was unnervingly silent as the warriors took their positions along the edge of the village, staring out into the dense forest. The moon hung high, casting pale light over the snow-covered ground. But even in the moonlight, the woods seemed darker than usual, like a living thing crouching and waiting to strike. Then came the sound, heavy, earth-shaking footsteps, like the march of 100 men, though the forest remained still. Harold exchanged a glance with Bjorn, who nodded, raising his sword. The warriors braced themselves, shields lifted, weapons at the ready. "Steady," Harold muttered. "Wait for them to show themselves." The first figure emerged from the trees slowly, and what stepped out into the clearing made Harold's blood run cold. It was not a man. Towering over them, the creature was nearly twice the height of the tallest Viking, its skin a pale, frost-bitten blue, its eyes glowing faintly like the embers of a dying fire. The Jotnar. "They're real," Freydis whispered, her voice trembling. The giant raised its head, sniffing the air like a wolf catching the scent of prey, and then let out a roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. From the shadows, more of them appeared. 3, 4, 5. until the clearing was full of the hulking creatures, their enormous axes gleaming in the moonlight. "Now!" Harold bellowed, charging forward with his sword raised high. His warriors followed suit, rushing into battle with battle cries that echoed through the night. But as they clashed with the giants, it became painfully clear how outmatched they were. Harold swung his blade with all his might, slashing across the giant's leg, but it barely flinched. One of the Jotnar swung its massive axe in return, and though Harold managed to dodge the blow, the sheer force of it knocked him off his feet, sending him sprawling in the snow. He gritted his teeth, scrambling back to his feet. Around him, the battle raged. Frightis fought like a demon, her axe biting deep into the leg of one of the giants, but it retaliated, slamming its fist into her shield and sending her crashing into a nearby tree. Bjorn was locked in combat with another giant, his sword flashing in the darkness, but even he struggled to keep up with the creature's brutal strength. "Harold!" Bjorn shouted over the din of battle, blood running down his face. "They're too strong. We need to fall back." Harold knew he was right. As much as he hated to admit it, they were being overpowered. The Jotnar weren't just bigger. They were faster, more resilient. If they stayed, they would all be slaughtered. "Fall back!" Harold roared, rallying his men. "To the village!" The warriors began to retreat, fighting their way back toward the village gates. Harold stayed at the front, cutting down any Jotnar that came too close, but it was a losing battle. For every one they wounded, another took its place, seemingly unbothered by the gashes and wounds inflicted on them. As they reached the safety of the village, Harold turned to see one of the giants standing in the clearing, watching them. It didn't chase after them. It simply stood there, its glowing eyes fixed on Harold, as if it were gauging him, judging him. "We've lost too many," Bjorn panted, collapsing against a wall. "Half our men are gone." Fritis, nursing a broken arm, spat blood onto the ground. "They'll come again. It's not over." Harold nodded, his jaw clenched. "No, it's not." He turned to the others, his gaze hard. "This isn't like any enemy we've faced before. We need answers. We need to know what these creatures are and how to stop them." Håkon stepped forward, his voice trembling. "There's one who may know." "Who?" Harold demanded. "The witch," Håkon replied, his eyes wide with fear. "She lives deep in the northern woods. She knows of the old magic, the curses of the Jotnar." Harold frowned. He had no love for magic, but he knew they were out of options. "Then we go north," Harold said, his voice firm. "If we want to survive, we'll need more than just swords. We'll need the truth." The icy wind cut through the village of Skalvik as dawn broke over the snow-covered hills. The previous night's battle still haunted Harold's mind, the roar of the Jotnar echoing in his ears. The warmth of the hearth in his longhouse did little to ease the chill in his bones as he prepared for what lay ahead. Harold stood by the fire, his hands tightening the leather straps of his fur-lined armor. His jaw was set, his eyes hard, focused. This journey to the north, to seek the witch who knew of the Jotnar and their dark secrets, was his only option now. He didn't trust magic, didn't trust witches, but these were not times for doubt. His people needed him to find a way to stop the giants. A knock sounded at the door, and Harold turned to see Bjorn enter, his face still bruised from the fight, but his spirit unbroken. His heavy footsteps echoed in the silent room as he approached. "Ready?" Bjorn asked, his voice gravelly. "As ready as I'll ever be," Harold replied, fastening his sword to his belt. "We ride at first light. Is the crew assembled?" Bjorn nodded, but his expression was grim. "A small band. Those brave or foolish enough to come along. Fritis, of course. Eirik, too, though he's still shaking from the fight." "And Yrsa?" Harold asked, knowing the answer already. Bjorn frowned, clearly unhappy. "She insists on coming. Says her knowledge of the old stories will guide us through the north, but I don't trust her." Harold shrugged. "I don't trust her either. But if there's any truth to the tale she's told, we'll need her. The Jotnar are more than flesh and bone. They're bound to the old magic, the runes, the sagas." Bjorn grunted. I hope you're right. Otherwise, we're following a skald's tale to our deaths. The door creaked open again, and Freyda stepped inside, her shield slung over her back and her axe gleaming at her hip. Her expression was fierce, her eyes lit with the fire of battle. Still planning to wander off into the frozen north to meet a witch? She asked, a teasing smirk tugging at her lips. Sounds like the beginning of a saga already. Harold chuckled, though there was no joy in it. Perhaps, though I don't intend for this saga to end with us dead in the snow. Freydis nodded, her face hardening. We'll do what we have to, for the village, for our people. She turned to Bjorn. Eric's ready to ride, though he looks like he's seen Odin's own ghost. Bjorn let out a bark of laughter. Poor lad barely knows how to swing a sword, and now he's heading into Jotunheim with us. But he's got a heart, I'll give him that. Let's hope his heart is enough, Harold said quietly, strapping his shield to his back. The wind howled as they gathered outside the village gates. Their small band of warriors stood by their horses, cloaked in furs, their faces grim and pale in the cold morning light. Yrsa, the skald, was already there, her hands tracing the runes carved into her staff. She looked up as Harold approached, her eyes gleaming with a strange, knowing light. The journey will be long, Yrsa said, her voice soft but carrying an eerie weight. And dangerous. The North holds secrets that have been buried for ages. If you are to face the Jotnar, you must understand them. Harold met her gaze, his expression unreadable. I'll understand them well enough when I bury my sword in their hearts. Yrsa smiled, though it was not a comforting smile. You may find that steel alone will not be enough. Harold didn't reply, his thoughts already turning to the road ahead. With a nod to Bjorn and Freydis, he mounted his horse, the leather creaking under his weight. The others followed suit, and within moments they were moving, the village of Skalvik fading into the distance as they rode north into the unknown. The journey through the frozen wilderness was brutal. Snow fell thick and fast, swirling around them like a white fog, making it hard to see more than a few paces ahead. The cold bit into their skin, even through the layers of fur and wool. Each breath came in ragged, visible clouds, and the constant wind howled in their ears. After hours of riding in silence, Freydis broke the quiet. How far is this witch supposed to be? She asked, her voice muffled by her scarf. Far enough, Harold replied, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of life. The elder said she lives beyond the Blackwood near the frozen lake. A day's ride if the gods are kind. Freydis snorted. The gods haven't been kind in a long time. Perhaps they'll smile on us for once, Bjorn muttered from the back of the group, his breath steaming in the air. Or perhaps we're heading into their judgment. Yrsa rode beside Harold, her hood pulled low over her face. She had been quiet for most of the journey, but now she spoke in a voice barely louder than the wind. The gods are watching us, Harold. They know what's at stake. The Jotnar aren't just monsters. They're part of the old world, the world that came before us. The witch may know how to stop them, but the cost will be high. Harold shot her a glance, frowning. What do you mean? Yrsa's eyes glittered from beneath her hood. There are forces in this world we do not understand. Forces that demand a price. To defeat the Jotnar, you may have to give more than you're willing. Harold's jaw tightened. I'll do what I must to protect my people. Yrsa smiled, a cryptic expression that sent a chill down his spine. We'll see. As the sun began to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow, the group reached the edge of the Blackwood. The trees loomed ahead, their branches twisted and dark, reaching out like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, and the silence was suffocating. This is it, Harold said, dismounting from his horse. We go on foot from here. Keep your weapons close. The Blackwood is said to be haunted. Haunted by what? Eric asked, his voice shaking. Ghosts, wolves, spirits of the dead, Freydis replied, a glint of amusement in her eyes. Take your pick. Bjorn clapped a hand on Eric's shoulder, grinning. Just stay close to me, boy. I'll keep the spirits off your back. The group moved cautiously into the woods, their breath hanging in the air like ghosts of their own. The trees creaked and groaned in the wind, but otherwise the forest was eerily still. Every step felt heavier, as if the forest itself was watching them, waiting for them to falter. Harold walked at the front, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained stoic. They were close now. He could feel it. The witch was somewhere ahead, and with her the answers they sought. Answers that could either save or doom them all. As night fell and the shadows deepened, the path ahead seemed to vanish into darkness. Yrsa, her voice barely above a whisper, spoke one last time. Be ready, Harold, for once you find her, nothing will ever be the same. Harold didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was racing with thoughts of the witch, the Jotnar, and the unknown price he might be forced to pay. But deep down he knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. The wind roared like a ravenous beast as Harold led his band through the Blackwood, the cursed forest that stood between them and the northern wilderness. The trees, black as coal and twisted like gnarled claws, seemed to bend and sway in unnatural ways. Snow fell in thick flurries, obscuring their path, and the cold bit at their faces like the teeth of a frost giant. The group moved cautiously, their boots crunching through the frozen earth, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of a tree or the distant call of a raven. Every so often, Eirik, the youngest of the group, would glance nervously over his shoulder as if expecting some dark creature to lunge at them from the shadows. Freydis walked close to him, her axe ready, her eyes sharp, always scanning the darkness. This place feels wrong, Freydis muttered, her breath fogging in the freezing air. Like we've wandered into the land of the dead. Bjorn, ever the skeptic, grunted in agreement. It's just a cursed forest. Keep your wits about you, and we'll be out of it soon enough. Yrsa, the skald, walked at Harold's side, her face hidden beneath the deep hood of her cloak. She moved with an eerie calm, as though the forest did not faze her in the slightest. Her eyes seemed to gleam with the knowledge of things that no one else could see. You feel it, don't you? Yrsa whispered to Harold, her voice barely audible over the wind. The forest knows we are here. It watches us. But it is not what you should fear. Harold glanced at her, frowning. What do you mean? Yrsa's lips curled into a cryptic smile. The forest is just the beginning. Beyond this lies something far worse. The north is waking. The Jotnar are stirring. The gods may be watching, but so are the forgotten powers. Harold's jaw tightened. He had little patience for riddles. I don't fear the forest or the Jotnar. We've faced worse and survived. Perhaps, Yrsa replied, her tone unsettling. But not everything can be survived. They pressed on in silence, each step feeling heavier than the last. The deeper they ventured into the Blackwood, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The cold gnawed at their bones, and even Bjorn, as tough as he was, began to show signs of strain. Freydis paused suddenly, holding up a hand. Do you hear that? Everyone stopped, their breaths freezing in the air, ears straining. At first there was nothing but the whistle of the wind through the trees. But then, faint and distant, there came a strange sound. A soft, rhythmic thumping, almost like the beat of a drum, but deeper, as though the earth itself were breathing. Bjorn scowled. It's probably just the wind. Freydis shook her head. No, that's not wind. Eric's voice trembled. What if it's the Jotnar? Harold gripped his sword tighter, his eyes scanning the forest. Stay close. Whatever it is, we keep moving. They continued their march, but the strange thumping grew louder, closer. Each beat sent a shiver down Harold's spine, like the pulse of some ancient slumbering creature. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches scratching at the sky, and the light grew dimmer, as though the very sun had been swallowed by the dark. Something's wrong, Bjorn muttered. We should have been through the forest by now. Yrsa stopped abruptly, her eyes fixed on a large, ancient tree ahead. Its bark was dark and cracked, covered in strange glowing runes that pulsed with an eerie, pale light. The others followed her gaze, and for the first time, a sense of true unease settled over the group. "By the gods," Fridas breathed. "What is that?" Yrsa stepped forward, her hand reaching out to trace the runes. "This is no ordinary tree. These are wards, ancient markings meant to keep something at bay. We've wandered into sacred ground." Harold's heart raced. "Wards? To keep what at bay?" Yrsa's eyes glinted in the dim light. "The giants." A heavy silence followed her words, the weight of them settling over the group like a shroud. Eric took a step back, fear etched into his young face. "We should leave. Now." "She's right," Fridas said, her voice low but firm. "We can't stay here." But just as they turned to leave, the ground beneath them trembled, and that deep, rhythmic thumping grew louder, closer, until it felt like the earth was shaking with each beat. The trees groaned, the snow shifting underfoot. Suddenly, from the shadows between the trees, something massive moved. A colossal figure stepped into view, its form barely visible in the gloom. It was larger than any man, its pale blue skin stretched tight over a hulking frame. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, two burning embers set deep into its skull. The Jotun towered above them, its breath a cloud of frost that billowed from its nostrils. The warriors froze, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. "By Thor's hammer," Bjorn whispered. The Jotun let out a low, rumbling growl, its gaze fixed on them with a primal hunger. Harold could feel the weight of its stare, the ancient power that radiated from the creature. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The very air froze in his lungs. Then, with a deafening roar, the Jotun charged. "Spread out!" Harold shouted, drawing his sword. "Now!" The group scattered as the giant's massive foot crashed into the ground where they had stood. Snow flew into the air, and the earth trembled beneath its weight. Fridas moved with lightning speed, her axe gleaming as she darted toward the creature's leg, slashing at its exposed calf. The blade bit deep, but the Jotun barely flinched, swatting at her with a hand the size of a man's shield. "Fridas, get back!" Bjorn yelled, rushing in with his sword raised. Harold circled the creature, looking for an opening. The Jotun was too big, too powerful to take down with brute force alone. They needed a plan, and fast. "Eric!" "Yrsa!" Harold barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Get behind it. Aim for the legs." Eric, pale with fear but determined, nodded and rushed toward the giant's other side, his sword raised. Yrsa followed, her movements quick and deliberate. The Jotun swung its massive arm, narrowly missing Fridas as she rolled out of the way. With a roar, Harold charged, driving his sword into the back of the creature's knee. The blade sank deep, and the Jotun let out a howl of pain, staggering forward. Bjorn seized the opportunity, leaping onto the giant's back and plunging his sword into its shoulder. But the Jotun was far from defeated. It thrashed wildly, knocking Bjorn to the ground with a brutal swipe of its arm. He hit the earth with a sickening thud, his breath knocked out of him. "Bjorn!" Harold shouted, rushing to his friend's side. The Jotun, wounded but enraged, turned its burning gaze on them, its massive hand reaching down to crush them both. For a heartbeat, Harold thought this was the end. But then Yrsa's voice rang out, a haunting, ancient song, the words echoing through the forest like the call of a forgotten god. The Jotun hesitated, its movements slowing as if entranced by the melody. Yrsa stood with her arms raised, her eyes closed, her voice carrying on the wind like a prayer. Harold didn't waste the moment. He grabbed Bjorn, dragging him out of the creature's reach, just as the Jotun's hand slammed into the ground where they had stood. "Fall back," Harold ordered. "Now." The group retreated into the forest, leaving the wounded giant behind, still swaying to the strange, haunting song. The trees closed around them and the darkness swallowed them whole. As they gathered their breath deeper in the forest, Bjorn coughed, wincing in pain. What in Odin's name was that? Yrsa's eyes, dark and mysterious, met Harold's. The first of many. The group stared at her in silence, the weight of their journey becoming all too real. The wind howled like a pack of hungry wolves, carrying with it the scent of ice and death. The terrain had grown harsher as Harold's band pushed further north, the once dense blackwood now giving way to an endless expanse of frozen wilderness. Jagged peaks loomed in the distance, casting long, ominous shadows across the snow-covered plains. Beyond those mountains lay Jotunheim, the land of the giants. Harold rode at the front of the group, his breath visible in the frigid air. His thoughts were heavy, weighed down by the recent encounter with the Jotun. Though they had wounded the giant, the price had been high. Bjorn's wounds were deep, his strength faltering. Eric was quiet, the terror of battle still etched into his young face. And Freydis, ever the fierce warrior, hid her fears behind a mask of defiance, but even she could not disguise the gravity of what they faced. The journey had changed them all. Each step deeper into the frozen north felt like a step away from the world they knew. It was as if the land itself was pulling them into a place where the gods held little sway, a place where ancient forgotten powers ruled. The silence was broken by Yrsa's voice. "We are close," she said, her words cutting through the wind like a blade. Harold glanced back at her. The Skald rode with a calm that unnerved him. She was always a step ahead, as if she knew more than she let on. "How do you know?" Harold asked, his tone gruff, though not hostile. He trusted Yrsa, but only to a point. Yrsa's eyes gleamed beneath her hood. "The air is different here. Colder, yes, but older. Can you not feel it? This is where the world begins to fray, where the edges of Midgard blur with Jotunheim." Freydis, riding beside Harold, snorted. "Feel it? All I feel is my bones freezing." Bjorn, slumped on his horse, managed a weak chuckle despite his pain. "If this is the edge of the world, I think I'll stay back. Let Harold deal with the giants." "You don't have much choice in the matter," Harold said, a rare grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. But the levity was short-lived. They had entered a realm of danger beyond any Viking saga. The lands ahead were as foreign as they were perilous. Suddenly, Freydis stopped, raising a hand. "Do you see that?" she asked, her voice tense. Her sharp eyes focused on a dark shape in the distance, half buried in snow. Harold squinted, then dismounted from his horse, trudging through the knee-deep snow to get a closer look. As he neared, the wind seemed to die, as though holding its breath. The object was large and twisted, its once sturdy walls now broken and splintered. An outpost, a Viking fortress long abandoned and ravaged by time and battle. Harold knelt in the snow, brushing away the frost that clung to the decaying wood. His heart sank as he realized what it was, a shield wall, shattered and worn by countless winters. Symbols of the Aesir and runes of protection were carved into the wood, but they had done little to stop whatever had come through here. "This was no ordinary outpost," Harold muttered. Yrsa approached, her brow furrowing as she traced the runes with her fingertips. "This was a last stand. The wards here. They were meant to keep something out or perhaps to trap something in." Freydis, with her axe resting on her shoulder, scanned the horizon. "If there were men here, they're long dead, either by the cold or by the Jotnar." A low groan came from Bjorn as he shifted on his horse. "And if we don't find shelter soon, I'll join them." Harold's mind raced. They were on the very edge of Jotunheim now, a place where few dared venture. Yet, they could not turn back. The village depended on them finding answers. Still, Bjorn's injuries were severe, and their supplies were running low. "We'll make camp here for the night," Harold said, his voice firm with authority. "Bjorn needs rest, and we need to gather our strength before crossing into Jotunheim." Freydis nodded, already moving to help Bjorn off his horse. Eirik, silent as ever, followed, though his eyes darted nervously at every shadow. The cold had seeped into their bones, but fear of the giants, fear of the unknown, gnawed at their hearts. As night fell, the group huddled around a small fire, the light flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. The old outpost creaked and groaned around them, its broken walls offering little protection from the icy winds. Fridas sat sharpening her axe, her expression hard and focused. Eric stared into the fire, his face pale, lips moving in silent prayer. Bjorn lay wrapped in furs, his breathing shallow but steady. Harold, however, could not sleep. He stood at the edge of the ruined fortress, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the jagged peaks of Jotunheim loomed like the teeth of a great beast. "You're thinking too much." Yrsa's voice came from behind him. She approached, her footfalls light as if she floated through the snow. Harold sighed. "I can't help it. This place, the Jotnar, it all feels like a trap, like we're being led somewhere, and we don't even know it." Yrsa's smile was faint, barely visible beneath her hood. "Perhaps we are, but that is the nature of destiny, Harold. It is a path we walk whether we know it or not." "Destiny?" Harold spat the word as if it tasted foul. "I don't care for destiny. I care about my people, about stopping these giants before they destroy everything." "And what if those two things are one and the same?" Yrsa asked, her eyes gleaming with something Harold could not quite place. "You think you are here by chance, but the gods have long guided men's fates, even those who do not wish to be guided." Harold shook his head, his frustration mounting. "I don't believe in the gods meddling in our lives. If the gods were watching, why would they let the Jotnar return? Why allow innocent people to suffer?" Yrsa stepped closer, her voice lowering to almost a whisper. "Perhaps the gods are testing you, Harold. Or perhaps the Jotnar are not what you think they are." Her words hung in the cold air, filling Harold with a strange unease. There was something deeper going on here, something Yrsa knew but wasn't saying. But before he could press her further, a low growl echoed through the darkness, sending a shiver down his spine. Freydis was on her feet in an instant, her axe in hand. What was that? Harold's hand went to his sword, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond the firelight. "Stay close to the fire," he ordered, his voice steady but tense. "Whatever it is, it's watching us." The growl came again, closer this time. Eric scrambled to his feet, his face pale with fear. "Giants?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "No," Yrsa said, her eyes narrowing. "Not giants." Suddenly from the shadows, a pack of wolves appeared, thin, snarling beasts with glowing eyes that reflected the firelight. They circled the group, their teeth bared, hungry and desperate. Harold stepped forward, sword drawn. "Wolves? I've dealt with worse." Freydis moved beside him, her expression fierce. "Let them come. They'll find we're not easy prey." The wolves growled, inching closer, their muscles tense and ready to spring. "Hold the line," Harold commanded, his heart pounding in his chest. We faced them together. The wolves lunged, and in that moment, the battle was joined. The wolves circled them, their yellow eyes glinting in the firelight like embers in the darkness. Harold stood tall, sword drawn, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Freydis crouched beside him, her axe gripped tightly in her hands, eyes locked on the nearest wolf. The pack growled, pacing just beyond the circle of light, waiting for the moment to strike. "Stay close," Harold barked. "We keep our backs to the fire. Don't give them an opening." Eirik, trembling, barely held his sword steady. "There are so many of them," he whispered, voice shaking with fear. Bjorn, still weakened from his injuries, leaned heavily on his shield, his face pale and strained. "Let's hope we don't have to fight them all." Yrsa remained calm, her staff clutched in her hands, the runes carved into it glowing faintly. Her eyes tracked the wolves, but she showed no fear. Instead, she whispered something under her breath, a low chant in a language older than any they spoke. The largest wolf, its fur streaked with gray, stepped forward, baring its teeth in a snarl. Harold narrowed his eyes, sizing it up, waiting for the attack. The tension in the air was thick, every breath drawn out in the stifling silence. And then, the first wolf leaped. With a snarl of his own, Harold swung his sword, the blade slicing through the air and catching the wolf mid-leap. The creature yelped as it crumpled to the ground, but the rest of the pack surged forward, their hunger overcoming their fear. Freydis swung her axe, cleaving another wolf's skull with brutal precision. "Come on, then," she roared, her voice carrying above the growls and snarls of battle. "You want a fight? I'll give you a fight." The wolves lunged from all sides. Harold fought with the precision of a seasoned warrior, his sword a blur as he parried bites and slashed at anything that got too close. Beside him, Freydis fought like a woman possessed, her axe biting deep into fur and flesh. Eirik, wild-eyed and panicked, swung his sword clumsily, barely keeping the wolves at bay. He stumbled backward, a wolf snapping at his heels, and fell to the ground. "Eirik!" Harold shouted, driving his sword through another wolf before rushing to the young warrior's side. The wolf that had pounced on Eirik growled, its fangs bared and glistening with saliva. But before it could bite, Harold's blade found its throat, sending a spray of blood into the snow. He hauled Eirik to his feet, gripping his arm tightly. "Focus," Harold snapped. "You're not dead yet." Eirik nodded, his face pale, but his grip on the sword steadied. "I won't let them kill me." Bjorn, still struggling to stay upright, used his shield to fend off another wolf, slamming it with a force that sent the creature sprawling. But he was weakening, his wounds draining his strength with every breath. "Yrsa," Harold called. "Do something." Yrsa, standing at the edge of the battle, her staff raised, continued her chant, her voice growing louder, more insistent. The runes on her staff began to glow brighter, and as her words echoed across the battlefield, something changed. The wolves faltered, their snarls turning into whimpers. Their eyes, once filled with bloodlust, softened, and slowly, one by one, they backed away from the group, retreating into the shadows. Harold stood, breathing hard, watching as the last of the wolves disappeared into the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of blood and death, but the immediate threat was gone. He turned to Yrsa, his sword still dripping with blood. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice heavy with suspicion. Yrsa lowered her staff, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "I gave them a reason to leave us be. Wolves have their own gods, their own spirits. I merely spoke to them in a language they understand." Freydis, wiping blood from her axe, looked at Yrsa with a raised brow. "And what did you promise them, Skald? Our lives for later?" Yrsa smiled faintly, her expression unreadable. "Nothing they would take. Not yet, anyway." Harold frowned but didn't press further. There were things about Yrsa he still didn't understand, things he wasn't sure he ever would. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. "We need to move," Harold said, wiping his sword clean in the snow. "The wolves won't be the last threat we face here. Jotunheim is close, and I don't want to be caught in the open when the giants find us." Bjorn groaned, struggling to his feet. "I'll be slower than a wounded bear," he grumbled, his breath labored. "But I'll keep moving. We have to." Freydis helped him to his feet, her expression softer than usual. "We'll drag you if we must. No one's getting left behind." Eirik, shaken but determined, sheathed his sword and nodded. "I'm ready. Let's keep going." The group gathered their supplies, stamping out the remnants of their fire before setting off again into the frozen night. The land around them was barren, an endless stretch of white beneath the stars with nothing but the wind and their own breath to break the silence. Hours passed in a blur of trudging through snowdrifts and bracing against the biting wind. The mountains of Jotunheim loomed ever closer, their jagged peaks piercing the sky like the teeth of a beast. As they reached the base of the first mountain, Harold called for a halt. His muscles ached, and his mind raced with thoughts of the Jotnar and the journey that lay ahead. "This is it," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "We're crossing into Jotunheim. There's no turning back now." Freydis looked up at the towering peaks, her jaw set with determination. "I've waited my whole life for a fight worthy of song. If the Jotnar are as fearsome as the tales say, we'll have a saga of our own before this is done." Yrsa, standing beside Harold, whispered softly, Jotunheim is not just the land of giants. It's a place where the boundaries between worlds weaken. The things we will face here are not just of this realm. Remember that. Eric shivered, not just from the cold. I'll try not to think about it, he muttered. Bjorn, his face pale but his spirit unbroken, managed a grin. Just stay behind me, lad. If the giants come for us, they'll have to go through me first. Harold smiled grimly, feeling the weight of his sword at his side. We've come this far. The Jotnar won't stop us now. With that, they began their ascent into Jotunheim. The climb was brutal, each step an effort as they fought against the biting wind and the steep, icy slopes. The world around them seemed to shift, the air growing thicker, heavier, as though the very land resented their presence. Strange shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, and the wind carried with it sounds, whispers, laughter, growls, that set their nerves on edge. As they reached a narrow pass between two towering cliffs, the land below disappeared into an ocean of mist. The snow gave way to jagged rocks, slick with frost, and the sky above seemed darker, as though the stars themselves were hiding. Suddenly, Ursa stopped, her eyes wide with recognition. "We're here," she whispered. Ahead, emerging from the mist, was an enormous stone gate, half buried in ice. It was ancient, covered in runes and carvings depicting battles between giants and gods. The gate marked the entrance to Jotunheim, the land of the giants. Harold stared at the gate, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the threshold between worlds, between the land of men and the realm of giants. A chill ran down his spine, colder than any winter wind. Freydis stepped forward, her voice quiet but steady. "Well, Harold," she said, her eyes locked on the gate. "Shall we knock?" Harold exhaled slowly, gripping the hilt of his sword. "Aye," he said. "We knock." With that, they crossed into Jotunheim, the land of giants. The gates of Jotunheim stood before them, towering slabs of ancient stone carved with intricate runes and images of long-forgotten battles. The air here was heavy, as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to awaken. The mist clung to the ground like a living thing, curling around the legs of Harold's group as they stood at the threshold of a world not meant for men. Harold stared at the gate, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like the cold air. This was it, the point of no return. Behind him, Bjorn leaned heavily on his shield. Freydis rested her hand on the pommel of her axe, and Eirik stood with wide, fearful eyes. Yrsa, calm as ever, stood silently, her eyes studying the runes with a look that was part reverence, part calculation. Harold tightened his grip on his sword. "This is Jotunheim," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We're in the land of the giants now." Freydis stepped forward, her breath fogging in the cold air. "The land of the dead, more like. Look at this place. It's as if the gods themselves abandoned it." Bjorn grunted in agreement, his face pale beneath his thick beard. If the gods did abandon this place, they left something else behind, something darker. He winced, gripping his side. His wounds from the previous battle had slowed him, but his spirit remained unbroken. Yrsa approached the gate, running her fingers over the ancient runes. "These markings are old," she murmured. "Older than any Viking runes I've seen. They speak of a curse, one placed on this land when the first giants walked the earth. The gates of Jotunheim are said to be sealed, but only for those who fear what lies beyond." Eric, standing nervously at the edge of the group, glanced around at the swirling mist. "What does that mean? Sealed for those who fear?" "It means," Yrsa said, her voice calm, "that the gate will open for us, if we are ready to face what awaits." Harold stepped forward, his eyes locked on the massive stone doors. "I didn't come this far to turn back now." He raised his sword and slammed the pommel against the gate, the sound echoing like thunder through the mountains. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind whistled through the peaks, and the group stood in tense silence, waiting. Then, with a low rumble, the gates began to move. The ancient stone groaned and cracked as the doors slowly swung open, revealing a narrow, winding path that led deeper into the mist-shrouded mountains. Harold turned to his companions, his jaw clenched. This is it. From here on, we move carefully. The giants are out there watching. We don't know what's waiting for us beyond these gates. Freydis nodded, her eyes gleaming with excitement. I've waited my whole life to fight something worthy of the sagas. If the Jotnar are watching, they'll see us coming. Bjorn let out a strained chuckle, despite the pain in his side. Let's just hope they don't see us too soon. Eric, pale and shaking, swallowed hard. Do you really think we'll find the Jotnar here? Harold placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder. We've faced worse than wolves and giants already, Eric. Keep your wits about you, and you'll see the end of this journey. Yrsa remained silent as they passed through the gate, her eyes flickering between the runes and the mist beyond. As the last of them crossed the threshold, the gates closed behind them with a resounding crash, sealing them inside the realm of the giants. The path ahead was treacherous, winding through steep cliffs and narrow ravines, the air colder and heavier with each step. The mist grew thicker, obscuring their vision, and strange sounds echoed from the mountains. Low groans, distant howls, and the occasional rumble of stone shifting under the weight of something enormous. These mountains, Freydis said, her voice hushed as she glanced up at the towering peaks. They don't feel right. It's like they're alive, watching us. Harold nodded, his eyes scanning the rocky path ahead. Everything in Jotunheim is different. We're not in Midgard anymore. We have to be ready for anything. Bjorn stumbled slightly, his face contorted in pain. Harold rushed to his side, gripping his arm to steady him. How are you holding up? Bjorn gritted his teeth, his voice strained. I'm not dead yet, but if I stop moving, I might be soon. Yrsa, walking beside them, glanced at Bjorn with a critical eye. The land here takes its toll on those who aren't prepared. The wounds you carry are more than physical now. Jotunheim drains the spirit as much as the body. Harold frowned. What do you mean? Yrsa's expression remained unreadable. This land was once home to the Jotnar, beings of primal strength and ancient power. Those who enter here are intruding on a place that has been dormant for centuries. It feeds on fear, doubt, and pain. Bjorn chuckled weakly, though there was no humor in his voice. Well then, it's doing a damn good job. Freydis turned, her hand resting on her axe. We'll get through this, Bjorn. You're too stubborn to die here. Bjorn smiled faintly. Stubbornness is all I have left. The group pressed on, the tension thickening with each step. The path grew steeper, the rocks slick with frost. They moved in silence, the only sounds their labored breaths and the crunch of snow beneath their boots. As they reached a narrow pass, the mist parted slightly, revealing a vast icy plain below. In the distance, massive stone structures rose from the ground, ruined towers and walls that stretched high into the sky, long abandoned and covered in frost. The remains of an ancient city, lost to time. By the gods, Eric whispered, staring in awe. What is that? Yrsa stepped forward, her eyes wide with wonder. That is Utgard, she said softly. The city of the giants, the heart of Jotunheim. Harold narrowed his eyes, scanning the distant ruins. Is this where we'll find the answers we seek? The way to stop the Jotnar? Yrsa nodded, her voice filled with quiet reverence. If there are any answers to be found, they will be there. Utgard was the seat of the Jotnar's power. Their kings ruled from those towers, their magic still lingers in the stones. Freydis tightened her grip on her axe, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. So, this is where we find them. The giants. Harold's stomach twisted with unease as he gazed at the distant city. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something that gnawed at his mind and heart. But he had no choice. His village, his people, they depended on him finding a way to stop the Jotnar before they unleashed their wrath upon the world once more. We move carefully, Harold said, his voice low. We don't know what's waiting for us in that city. Stay close, and be ready for anything. The group descended the mountain path, heading toward the icy plain below. As they moved closer to Utgard, the air grew colder, heavier, and the sense of being watched intensified. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every gust of wind carried a whisper of something unseen. Freydis, walking beside Harold, glanced at him, her expression hard. "Do you think we'll make it out of here, Harold?" Harold didn't answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the looming towers ahead. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice grim. "But I do know this. We'll face whatever comes together." Yrsa, walking a few paces ahead, stopped suddenly. Her eyes narrowed, her hand tightening around her staff. "We're not alone." Harold froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the horizon but saw nothing. "What is it?" Yrsa's voice was barely a whisper. "They're here." The ground beneath them rumbled, and from the shadows of the ancient city, figures began to emerge. Massive, hulking shapes that moved with a terrible, unnatural grace. The Jotnar. Harold drew his sword, his breath caught in his throat. The giants were here. "Prepare yourselves," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "The battle for Jotunheim begins now." The ground beneath them trembled as the Jotnar emerged from the shadowed ruins of Utgard. Massive figures, their pale, frost-bitten skin glistening like ice in the dim light, moved with slow, deliberate strides. Each step sent a shudder through the frozen earth, as if the very land of Jotunheim was waking from its ancient slumber. The giants were coming. Harold gripped his sword tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen battle many times before, but never against foes like these. The Jotnar were more than mere enemies. They were living legends, creatures of the old world. Their towering forms loomed like mountains in the mist, their eyes glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Beside him, Freydis hefted her axe, her expression fierce but laced with awe. "By the gods," she breathed. "They're even bigger than the stories say." Bjorn, leaning heavily on his shield, grimaced through the pain of his wounds. "I'm not sure if we should fight them or run," he muttered, his voice strained. "Though I'm not much for running." "We can't run," Harold replied, his voice low but steady. "This is why we came. We face them, or we fail. There's no other path." Eric, pale and trembling, stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. How do we fight that?" he stammered, pointing at the largest of the giants, a behemoth with a crown of jagged ice and a long, twisted spear that looked capable of skewering a man with ease. Harold placed a hand on Eric's shoulder, squeezing it firmly. "We fight the same way we've always fought, with everything we have. Stay close, watch each other's backs, and remember what's at stake." Yrsa, standing apart from the group, her eyes focused on the giants, whispered softly, almost to herself. "These are not the Jotnar of legend. These are the cursed ones, trapped here by their own hubris. They will not show mercy." Harold glanced at her. "Cursed?" Yrsa nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "The giants were once rulers of this land, but they angered the gods. Odin himself placed a curse on them, sealing them in Jotunheim, bound by ancient magic. They are not like us, Harold. They are beyond life and death." Freydis tightened her grip on her axe. "Good. Let them know we're beyond fear." The Jotnar, their massive feet crushing the snow and ice beneath them, drew closer. The leader, the one with the ice crown, raised its spear high, letting out a deep, rumbling roar that echoed across the icy plain. It was a sound filled with rage, ancient and primal, a call to battle that made the air itself tremble. "They're attacking," Bjorn shouted, raising his shield. "Harold, what's the plan?" Harold's mind raced as he stared up at the towering figures. They couldn't fight the Jotnar head-on, not with brute force alone. The giants were too large, too strong. But they had weaknesses. Every creature did. He had to find it. "Freydis, Yrsa, and I will focus on the leader," Harold commanded, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his gut. Bjorn, you and Eric keep the others distracted. Hit and retreat. Don't get too close. We don't need to kill them all. Just bring the leader down. Freydis grinned, her eyes gleaming with battle lust. Finally, a real fight. She charged forward without hesitation, her axe raised high, moving like a wolf in the snow. Bjorn, though clearly weakened, managed to heft his shield and give Harold a nod. We'll keep them busy. Don't die on us, Harold. Harold smiled grimly. Same to you. The battle erupted with a fury that rivaled the worst of storms. The Jotnar, despite their immense size, moved with terrifying speed. The leader, its icy spear gleaming like frozen death, swung at Freydis as she darted between its legs, narrowly avoiding a blow that would have shattered her bones. She retaliated with a savage strike to the giant's calf, her axe biting deep into the flesh. Harold moved quickly, circling around to flank the creature. He could feel the weight of the ancient magic that bound this place, a coldness that seemed to seep into his very soul. The Jotnar weren't just enemies, they were forces of nature, beings tied to the land in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. Yrsa! Harold shouted over the din of battle. What magic binds them? How do we stop it? Yrsa, her staff glowing faintly with runic power, moved closer to the leader, her eyes narrowed in concentration. The curse is in their blood, in their bones. It's woven into the land itself. But if we can break the leader's will, shatter its connection to Jotunheim, the others will fall. Harold cursed under his breath. Shatter its will? How did you break the will of a creature older than the stones they stood on? The leader of the Jotnar roared again, the sound shaking the very ground beneath them. It swung its spear in a wide arc, forcing Harold to roll out of the way, the icy tip grazing his shoulder. Pain shot through him, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for pain. Freydis, hit it again, Harold barked as he struggled to his feet. We need to weaken it. Freydis didn't need to be told twice. With a wild battle cry, she charged again, this time aiming for the giant's other leg. Her axe cleaved through muscle and sinew, and the giant staggered, its balance momentarily thrown off. Now! Yrsa shouted, her voice suddenly sharp and commanding. Harold, drive your sword into the ground. Harold blinked, confused. What? Do it. The earth here is old. It will respond to steel forged in the fires of men. Now! Trusting Yrsa's wisdom, Harold raised his sword high and plunged it into the frozen earth at his feet. For a moment nothing happened, then the ground beneath them shuddered violently. A crack of blinding light spread from the point where Harold's sword pierced the earth, running toward the Jotnar leader like lightning across the ice. The giant let out a terrible roar as the ground beneath it began to break apart, its connection to the land of Jotunheim unraveling. The light surged upward, enveloping the giant's body in a blinding white glow. Freydis, who had just delivered another devastating blow to the creature's leg, jumped back, her eyes wide. What in the name of Odin? Yrsa's voice rang out over the chaos, clear and strong. The curse is breaking. Keep pushing. Harold gripped his sword tightly as the magic surged around him. The giant's form flickered, its body seeming to dissolve into the light. The others in the pack faltered, their movement sluggish, as though the power binding them was draining away. With one final deafening roar, the leader of the Jotnar collapsed, its body turning to dust and ice that scattered on the wind. The other giants, now without their leader, began to retreat, their enormous forms dissolving into the mist, leaving nothing behind but the echo of their howls. Harold stood panting, his sword still buried in the ground, the weight of the battle crashing down on him all at once. His heart thundered in his chest, and his arms felt like lead. But they had done it. They had defeated the giants, at least for now. Freydis, her face streaked with blood and sweat, walked over and clapped him on the back. We did it, Harold. We sent them running. Bjorn limped over, leaning heavily on Eric. By Thor's hammer, I thought we were done for. I've never seen anything like that. Yrsa, her face calm but weary, approached, her eyes meeting Harold's. The curse isn't fully broken, she said quietly. But we've weakened them. Utgard still holds its secrets. Harold nodded, his breath slowing. Then we press on. We came for answers, and we'll find them. They had won a battle, but the war with the giants was far from over. The dust of the fallen Jotnar still lingered in the cold air as Harold and his companions stood at the edge of the ruined city of Utgard. The victory had been hard won, but the eerie silence that followed was no comfort. The wind that howled through the crumbling towers seemed to carry whispers of old secrets, of powers long forgotten. Each breath they took felt heavier, weighed down by the ancient magic that saturated this cursed place. Harold wiped the sweat from his brow, his hand trembling slightly. He had faced death many times, but something about this battle had been different. The giants weren't just enemies of flesh and blood. They were forces of nature, bound to the land in ways he couldn't fully understand. And now, they were on the edge of something even greater. Yrsa, her dark eyes sharp and focused, stepped forward, her gaze locked on the towering ruins before them. "The heart of Utgard still holds its secrets," she murmured. "The giants may have fallen, but their power lingers. We've only unlocked the surface of the curse." Freydis, her axe resting on her shoulder, spat into the snow. "Secrets or no, we've come this far. Let's finish what we started. I didn't come to Jotunheim to turn tail now." Bjorn, still leaning heavily on his shield, winced as he shifted his weight. His wounds had taken their toll, but his spirit remained unbroken. "I don't know about the rest of you," he muttered, his breath fogging in the freezing air. "But I've had enough of giant curses and ancient cities. We're deep in the belly of the beast now." Harold remained silent, staring up at the ancient stone walls of Utgard. The city, once the heart of the Jotnar's power, now stood like a tomb, its grandeur long gone, but the weight of its history pressed down on them. He could feel it, the magic, the curse. It was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. Whatever lay at the heart of this place, it was the key to ending the Jotnar threat. "We go in," Harold finally said, his voice steady but grim. "Yrsa's right. The power of this place isn't broken. The giants were protecting something. If we want to stop them for good, we need to find it." Eirik, who had remained quiet during the battle, looked nervously at the towering ruins. "But what if what we find is worse than the giants?" His voice wavered, filled with the fear that had gnawed at him since they first set foot in Jotunheim. Harold turned to the young warrior, his expression softening. "We didn't come here because it was safe, Eirik. We came because we had no choice. Our people depend on us. No matter what we find inside, we face it together. Fear won't save us now." Eirik nodded, though his fear was far from gone. He gripped his sword tighter, as if the cold metal might ward off the darkness lurking in the city's depths. "Stay sharp," Harold warned, as they moved toward the entrance to Utgard. "The giants are gone, but this place holds more than just their bones." The massive stone gates of Utgard loomed ahead, cracked and weathered by centuries of abandonment. Runes, worn and faded, still glowed faintly along the edges, remnants of the old magic that had sealed this city from the world. Yrsa approached the gate, her fingers tracing the symbols, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's still sealed," she said quietly. "But only barely. The giant's defeat weakened the wards. I can open it." Freydis snorted. "Then what are you waiting for? Let's not stand around in the cold longer than we have to." Yrsa ignored her, focusing on the runes. She began to chant softly, the ancient language of the old gods spilling from her lips like a forgotten song. The air grew colder, if that was even possible, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with energy. The runes flared to life, glowing brighter and brighter until, with a deafening crack, the gates of Utgard shuddered and slowly swung open. Harold felt the weight of the moment as the gates revealed the dark, empty streets beyond. The city was vast, its structures towering high above them, but everything was cold, lifeless. The heart of Utgard had been frozen in time, as though the giants themselves had stopped the very breath of the city when the gods cursed them. "Stay close," Harold ordered, stepping forward. We don't know what's waiting for us in there. The group moved cautiously through the ancient streets, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Broken statues of Jotnar kings lined the paths, their faces worn away by time, their eyes hollow and accusing. The air was thick with magic, a palpable force that weighed down on their shoulders like a heavy cloak. "Where is everyone?" Eric asked, his voice trembling slightly. "The city looks like it's been empty for centuries." "It has been," Yrsa said, her eyes scanning the towering buildings. "But the giants were bound here, trapped in this place by the curse. Their spirits linger, even if their bodies don't." Freydis sneered. "Spirits or not, I'd rather face flesh and bone. At least we can kill that." As they ventured deeper into the city, the oppressive silence grew heavier, and the sense of being watched became unbearable. The shadows seemed to move, and strange whispers drifted on the icy wind, though no one could say where they came from. Bjorn, limping beside Harold, grimaced as he glanced at the empty windows of the towering buildings. "Something's not right here, Harold. This place feels alive, but not in any way that makes sense." Harold nodded grimly. "It's the curse. The magic that binds this city hasn't faded. It's waiting." "Yrsa, what are we looking for?" Yrsa stopped, her gaze fixed on a towering structure at the center of the city. "There, the throne room of the Jotnar kings. Whatever power still holds this city together, it lies there." Freydis cracked her knuckles, her eyes glinting with anticipation. "Then let's end it. Whatever dark magic they've been hiding, we'll break it." As they approached the towering hall, the air grew colder still, the very stones of the ground frosted over with ancient ice. The entrance was guarded by two massive statues of Jotnar warriors, their stone weapons raised in silent warning. Harold's heart pounded as they stepped through the door, entering the heart of the giant's ancient power. The throne room was vast, its ceiling disappearing into the darkness above. At the far end of the hall, a massive throne carved from a single piece of ice loomed over them, its surface glistening with strange ethereal light. The throne was empty, but the air in the room thrummed with power, a presence that made the hair on the back of Harold's neck stand on end. "By the gods," Eric whispered. "What is this place?" Yrsa stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "This is where the Jotnar kings ruled. The curse was placed here at the heart of their power. If we can break it, the connection between the Jotnar and this land will be severed." Harold stared up at the massive throne, his hand tightening around his sword. "And how do we break it?" Yrsa hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "The throne, it holds their will, their essence. We must destroy it, but the magic that binds it is old, stronger than anything we've faced." Freydis grinned, stepping forward with her axe raised. "Then we break it the old way, with steel and strength." Before anyone could stop her, Freydis swung her axe at the throne. The sound of metal striking ice rang out like a thunderclap, but instead of cracking, the throne pulsed with light, sending Freydis flying back with a force that shook the room. Harold rushed to her side. "Freydis!" Freydis groaned, clutching her chest where the magic had struck her. That didn't go as planned," she muttered, her voice strained. Yrsa knelt beside the throne, her eyes wide with realization. "It's not just ice. It's bound to the giant spirits, their will. We'll need more than steel to destroy it." Harold stood, his heart racing. "Then tell me what we need, Yrsa. How do we break this curse once and for all?" Yrsa met his gaze, her expression grim. "We need the blood of a Jotun king. Only then can we sever the magic that binds this place." Harold's stomach twisted. The giants they had faced were dead, their leader reduced to dust. But Yrsa's eyes flickered with dark understanding. "The blood of a Jotun king," she repeated softly. "Or the blood of one who shares their lineage." Harold froze, his hand tightening on his sword. The truth hit him like a blow to the chest. "You knew." he whispered, his voice barely audible. You knew all along. Yrsa's gaze didn't waver. The curse is older than any of us, Harold. Older than Midgard itself. And you carry the blood of the giants in your veins. You are the key to breaking it. The room fell silent, the weight of Yrsa's words sinking in. Harold's heart thundered in his chest as the truth settled like a stone in his gut. He wasn't just a warrior come to stop the giants. He was part of the curse itself. The fate of his people, of the world, rested in his blood. And he didn't know if he had the strength to sacrifice everything. The silence in the ancient throne room of Utgard was deafening, heavy with the weight of Yrsa's words. Harold's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a slow, heavy thud that echoed through the vast chamber. His blood. It was his blood that would either break the curse or doom them all. The realization clamped down on him like iron shackles, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Freda, still recovering from the magical blast that had thrown her back, struggled to her feet, her face pale with pain, but her eyes blazing with anger. What in Odin's name is she talking about, Harold? Your blood? Harold opened his mouth, but no words came. His mind raced, trying to grasp the truth that had been hidden from him his entire life. He was no ordinary warrior. He was tied to the very thing they had come to destroy. The Jotnar. The giants. Yrsa stood in front of the throne, her face calm yet shadowed with the weight of knowledge. Harold, she said softly, you've always felt it, haven't you? The pull, the connection to the old magic, to the stories of the Jotnar. The truth is, in your lineage, you are descended from the giants, from their ancient bloodline. That's why the curse recognizes you. That's why it reacts to your presence. Freydis let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. Harold, a giant, that's madness. Bjorn, leaning heavily on his shield, his face tight with pain, glanced between Harold and Yrsa. I don't understand. How can this be? Harold, you're one of us. I am, Harold said, finally finding his voice, though it felt strange and distant. His gaze was locked on Yrsa, anger rising in his chest. You knew this all along, didn't you? You brought me here knowing I'd have to sacrifice myself to break the curse. Yrsa didn't flinch, but her eyes were full of regret. I didn't know for certain, she replied quietly, but I suspected. The Jotnar's bloodline runs thin in Midgard, but you've always been different. The way the earth reacts to you, the way the old magic bends in your presence, it could only mean one thing. You are the last of their line, Harold, the last connection between the giants and our world. Eric, standing pale and shaken, his eyes wide with disbelief, finally spoke up. What does this mean? Does Harold have to die to stop the curse? Yrsa's gaze shifted to the young warrior, her expression grave. It means that the magic binding Utgard and the Jotnar to this world can only be severed by the blood of its own kin. Harold's blood. He doesn't have to die, but... Her voice trailed off, the unspoken possibility hanging in the air. Harold's chest tightened, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like the cold walls of the throne room. He had fought so hard, traveled so far, all to stop the Jotnar from destroying his village, his people. And now he stood on the precipice, his own blood the key to ending it all. But could he make that sacrifice? Could he give up everything for the sake of the world? Freda stepped forward, her eyes blazing with defiance. No, I won't let you do this. We've fought too hard to let this be the end, Harold. There has to be another way. There is no other way, Yrsa said, her voice steady but sad. The giant's power is woven into this land, and only blood can break it. The Jotnar are bound to the throne, to the magic that holds this place together. If we don't stop it here, they will return, and next time, we won't be able to fight them off. Harold felt the weight of his sword in his hand, the cold steel a reminder of all he had sacrificed, all he had fought for. He had always believed that strength, courage, and loyalty would be enough to see him through any battle. But this was different. This was not a fight of swords or axes. This was a battle with destiny itself. Bjorn's voice, strained but full of the familiar camaraderie they had shared for years, broke the silence. "Harold, you don't have to do this. We've faced giants, wolves, and worse. There's always another way." Harold looked at his old friend, the man who had stood by him through countless battles, and saw the fear in his eyes, not just fear for his own life, but for Harold's. Frida stood beside Bjorn, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of her axe, ready to fight the gods themselves if it meant saving him. Eric, the boy who had been so full of fear and doubt, now stood with a desperate hope shining in his eyes. But it was Yrsa's face that held his attention. The Skald, who had guided them through this cursed land, knew the truth. She had seen it in the old magic, in the runes and whispers of the world beyond their understanding. Her eyes, full of sorrow and resolve, told him what he had known all along. There was no other way. "I have to," Harold said quietly, his voice steady, though inside he felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. "If I don't, the Jotnar will return. They'll destroy everything we've fought to protect." Frida shook her head, tears of frustration brimming in her eyes. "This isn't fair, Harold. You don't deserve this. You're not one of them. You're one of us." Harold smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm both, Freydis. I'm a Viking, and I'm a part of this curse. That's why I have to do this." He stepped forward, toward the throne, and as he did, the air around him seemed to hum with power. The throne, once cold and lifeless, began to glow with a faint blue light. The ancient magic, the curse that had bound the giants to this world, was stirring. Yrsa approached him, her hand outstretched. "I'll guide you," she said softly. "You won't be alone." Harold took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked back at his companions one last time, his gaze lingering on Freydis, Bjorn, and Eirik. He saw the fear, the pain in their eyes, but also their loyalty. They had come this far with him, and now he would finish it. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice steady, "you fight on, you live." With that, Harold stepped forward and placed his hand on the icy throne. A jolt of cold shot through him, and the runes that covered the seat flared to life, glowing with an intense light. The air crackled with energy as the magic within the throne awoke, responding to his presence, to his bloodline. Yrsa began to chant, her voice low and resonant, the ancient words wrapping around them like a shroud. The light grew brighter, enveloping Harold, and he could feel the pull of the curse deep within his veins, tugging at his very soul. The magic of the giants flowed through him, burning with a cold fire, and Harold knew in that moment what he had to do. He unsheathed his sword, the blade gleaming in the ethereal light. With one final look at his friends, he drove the sword into his palm, letting his blood spill onto the throne. The effect was immediate. The light flared brighter than the sun, and a deep, rumbling sound filled the chamber as the magic of the giants was severed, the connection between the Jotnar and the land finally broken. Harold fell to his knees, his strength drained, his vision blurring. The pain was immense, but he welcomed it. He had done what needed to be done. As the light faded and the throne crumbled to dust, Yrsa knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "It is done," she whispered. "The curse is broken." Harold, his voice barely a whisper, looked up at her. "Will they be safe now? My people? My village?" Yrsa nodded, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Yes, Harold, you saved them." Freydis, Bjorn, and Eirik rushed to his side, their faces etched with grief. Harold smiled weakly at them, his vision growing dim. "I did what I had to do," he said softly. And then, with a final breath, Harold Ironhand, the warrior who carried the blood of the giants, fell silent. The curse of the Jotnar had been broken, but the cost had been great. Freydis knelt beside him, her tears freezing as they hit the cold stone. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You should have lived." Bjorn, his face grim, placed a hand on her shoulder. "He chose this path, Freydis. He saved us all." Yrsa stood silently, her head bowed. She had known this was the only way, but it didn't make the loss any easier to bear. The hero of Skalvik had given everything, not just for his people, but for the world. The city of Utgard, now free from the curse of the giants, stood in eerie silence, a tomb for the last of the Jotun kings. The wind howled through the ruins of Utgard, carrying with it the last whispers of ancient power. The throne of the Jotnar kings had crumbled to dust, and with it, the curse that had bound the giants to this land. But the victory felt hollow, a bitter taste left in the mouths of the survivors. Harald Ironhand, the warrior who had led them through the perils of Jotunheim, lay still and cold on the frozen ground. His blood spilled to sever the connection between the giants and Midgard. Freydis knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she closed his lifeless eyes. Her breath came in ragged bursts, each one clouding in the cold air before fading into nothing. The fierce shield maiden who had faced giants, wolves, and the endless cold of Jotunheim could barely hold back the tears that stung her eyes. "Harald," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You shouldn't have had to do this. You should have lived." Bjorn, still limping from his injuries, stood a few paces away, his hand resting heavily on the hilt of his sword. His face was pale, his usual boisterous humor drained from him, replaced by a quiet, pained silence. "He always knew," Bjorn said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Even before we did. He knew he was tied to this place, to them." Eric, the youngest of their group, stood awkwardly nearby, his face ashen with grief. He clutched his sword with white-knuckled hands, but the blade hung limp at his side. "He saved us," Eric murmured, his voice barely audible. "He saved everyone. Our people, the village. I never thought—" He trailed off, his eyes wet with tears. Freydis rose to her feet slowly, the weight of Harald's sacrifice heavy on her shoulders. Her hands curled into fists as she glared at the empty throne that had been the center of so much pain and suffering. "We were supposed to fight together, Harald. We were supposed to go back and tell stories of this battle, not this." Yrsa, standing at the edge of the group, watched in silence. Bjorn's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. "We need to take him home," he said softly. "We need to honor him as he deserves." Freydis nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Together, they prepared to carry Harald's body back through the frozen wastes, back to Skalvik. The journey would be long and the cold unforgiving, but they would not leave him here in the land of giants. He would be laid to rest among his own, his name sung in the halls of his ancestors. The trek back through the mountains was silent and grim. The joy of victory, the thrill of battle, had long since faded, replaced by the bitter sting of loss. The weight of Harald's body, wrapped in furs to protect him from the icy wind, was carried by Freydis, Bjorn, and Eirik, each of them taking turns to bear the burden of their fallen leader. As they crossed the desolate plains, the skies darkened, heavy with snow. The wind howled around them, and every step felt like a battle against the very land itself. But they pressed on, driven by their duty to Harald and the promise of bringing him home. Eirik, his voice hoarse from the cold, finally broke the silence. "Will the village know what he did? Will they understand?" "They'll know," Freydis said quietly, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "We'll make sure they know. Harald Ironhand's name will be remembered for generations. His sacrifice will be honored." Bjorn, limping beside them, grunted in agreement. "He'll be remembered in the sagas, no doubt." Bjorn's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. "We need to take him home," he said softly. "We need to honor him as he deserves." Freydis nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Together they prepared to carry Harald's body back through the frozen wastes, back to Skalvik. The journey would be long and the cold unforgiving, but they would not leave him here in the land of giants. He would be laid to rest among his own, his name sung in the halls of his ancestors. The trek back through the mountains was silent and grim. The joy of victory, the thrill of battle, had long since faded, replaced by the bitter sting of loss. The weight of Harold's body, wrapped in furs to protect him from the icy wind, was carried by Freydis, Bjorn, and Eirik, each of them taking turns to bear the burden of their fallen leader. As they crossed the desolate plains, the skies darkened, heavy with snow. The wind howled around them, and every step felt like a battle against the very land itself. But they pressed on, driven by their duty to Harold and the promise of bringing him home. Eirik, his voice hoarse from the cold, finally broke the silence. Will the village know what he did? Will they understand? They'll know, Freydis said quietly, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. We'll make sure they know. Harold Ironhand's name will be remembered for generations. His sacrifice will be honored. Bjorn, limping beside them, grunted in agreement. He'll be remembered in the sagas, no doubt. A warrior who fought against the giants, who saved his people by giving everything he had. There aren't many like him. Yrsa, walking behind them, her staff glowing faintly in the dim light, spoke up. He will be sung of for ages to come. His story will echo through time, passed down from one generation to the next. He may be gone, but his name will live on. Freydis clenched her jaw. It's not enough. Bjorn looked at her, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? It's not enough, she repeated, her voice tight with emotion. Stories, sagas, they don't bring him back. They don't fill the hole he's left behind. We'll sing of him, yes, but it won't ever be enough. Bjorn sighed heavily. No, it won't. But it's all we have. When they finally reached the village of Skalvik, the sun had begun to set, casting the land in hues of deep blue and purple. The people of the village gathered as they approached, their faces pale and solemn as they saw the body of their leader, wrapped in furs carried by the companions who had gone with him into the land of the giants. The village elder, Hakon, stepped forward, his eyes full of sorrow. Harold Ironhand has returned to us, he said, his voice trembling. The man who faced the giants and gave his life for his people. Freydis stepped forward, her voice strong despite the grief that weighed on her heart. He gave everything for us. For you, for all of us. The Jotnar are gone, the curse broken. But Harold won't be forgotten. The villagers gathered around, their heads bowed in respect. A pyre was built at the edge of the village, high and proud, to honor the man who had saved them all. As night fell, the flames rose high into the sky, casting the village in a warm, flickering glow. Freydis, Bjorn, Eirik, and Yrsa stood at the edge of the fire, watching as Harold's body was consumed by the flames, his spirit released to the gods. Freydis whispered a quiet prayer, her hand resting on the hilt of her axe. May you find peace in Valhalla, Harold. You've earned your place among the gods. Bjorn nodded, his voice rough with emotion. I'll see you again, old friend. We'll drink together in the halls of Valhalla. Eirik stood silently, tears streaming down his face. He had lost more than a leader. He had lost the man who had given him the courage to fight. And Yrsa, her face illuminated by the fire, spoke the final words of the saga. Harold Ironhand, son of Midgard, blood of Jotunheim, may your name live on in the songs of men, until the end of all things. The flames roared higher, and the night sky was filled with embers, like stars scattered across the heavens. Epilogue. Years passed, and the tale of Harold Ironhand was told far and wide. It became a legend, a story of courage and sacrifice, of a man who faced the giants of old and gave his life to save his people. Songs were sung in his honor, and his name echoed in the halls of warriors. But for Freydis, Bjorn, and Eirik, the story was more than a legend. It was a memory, a wound that would never fully heal. They carried Harold's spirit with them, in every battle, in every storm. And though the world moved on, they never forgot the man who had led them through the darkest of times. Harold Ironhand was gone, but his story, his sacrifice, would live forever.